Jake never expected to return home to this. The moment he pulled into his driveway, something was wrong. The usual quiet hum of the neighborhood had been shattered by the relentless thud of bass-heavy music, the unmistakable sound of a microphone screeching, and was that chanting? He barely had time to react before his garage door started rising, revealing a scene so outrageous he nearly choked on his coffee. His garage, his private space, had been invaded. A full-blown Zumba class was in progress. 15 people in blindingly neon leggings were jumping, spinning, and sweating all over his concrete floor. The air was thick with the smell of citrusy body spray and the sharp sting of desperation. His workbench, his tools, even his bike hanging from the ceiling were still where he had left them, but the space itself had been hijacked, transformed into some sort of chaotic fitness cult headquarters. And then he saw her, Karen, standing dead center, arms folded over her obnoxiously pink tracksuit. A smirk stretched across her face like she was the queen of some conquered land. Karen, the self-proclaimed dictator of the HOA, the woman who wielded rules, her rules, like a sword, striking down anyone who dared oppose her reign. The moment their eyes met, she clapped her hands once, addressing him like a butler who had arrived late to serve her. "Look, you're here," she announced as if she had invited him into his own home. "We're just finishing up our warm-up. Why don't you come back in an hour?" Jake's pulse spiked. "Come back? Karen, this is my garage. What the hell is going on?" Karen rolled her eyes with exaggerated patience, turning to her class. "Ladies, we have a complainer. Just ignore him. He'll get over it." "He'll get over it?" Before Jake could gather his thoughts, one of the women, an older lady in a blinding purple leotard, glanced over her shoulder at him. "Sir," she huffed, "you're blocking the airflow." Jake's eye twitched. His hands clenched. He turned back to Karen, voice sharp as a blade. "Karen, explain, now." Karen gave him that insufferable, patronizing smile, the one that made his blood boil. "The HOA voted to repurpose underutilized spaces for community activities," she said, sweeping her hand around the garage as if unveiling the Eiffel Tower. "This was the best option. It's so roomy, perfect for our fitness program." Jake couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What vote? I never voted for this." Karen's smirk didn't falter. "Oh, well, you weren't there." His teeth clenched. "That's because no one told me." Karen shrugged, utterly unbothered. "We put up a notice." Jake knew damn well there had been no notice. "You can't just take over my garage," he seethed. "Karen, this is my property." "Oh, don't be dramatic," she waved a hand dismissively. "It's still technically yours. We're just sharing it." Jake's patience snapped. "Get out! Now!" Karen's face twisted. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," he growled. "This isn't a public space. It's my garage, and you," he pointed directly at her, "and your entire class are trespassing." A few women exchanged uneasy glances, the neon-colored glow of their rebellion dimming just a little. But Karen? She straightened, eyes flashing with that self-righteous HOA authority she loved to wield like a medieval queen. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "if you have a problem with it," Jake already knew what was coming, "I guess we'll have to call security." For a second, Jake almost laughed. "Security?" he scoffed. "Oh, Ted, from 3 houses down." Karen, unfazed, whipped out her phone with a dramatic flourish, her fingers tapping furiously. Jake stared at her, then at the group still bouncing and spinning in his garage. This wasn't just a one-time thing. Karen had no intention of stopping, and if there was one thing he knew for sure, it was about to get a whole lot worse. Karen's lips curled in fury as Jake doubled over with laughter, wiping away a fake tear of amusement. "You think this is funny?" she hissed, shoving a clipboard against his chest with the urgency of someone delivering a court summons. Jake lazily glanced at the paper, his smirk growing as he read the absurdity printed in official-sounding jargon. "A $500 fine for refusing to let a pack of over-enthusiastic aerobics enthusiasts take over my private property?" He shook his head, barely holding back another laugh. "Karen, you really outdid yourself this time." Her nostrils flared. "This is a legitimate fine issued by the HOA under the newly established—" Jake cut her off, tapping the bottom of the paper where fine print betrayed her scheme. "Actually, Karen, according to HOA's bylaws, any fine exceeding $100 requires a vote from all homeowners, not just you and your little circle of self-appointed overlords." He flicked the paper back at her, watching the realization dawn on her face, a single eye twitch, a bury there stumble in her stance. But then, like a seasoned villain, she recovered. "You don't understand, Jake," she snapped, voice laced with poorly concealed desperation. "This is for the community." Jake leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You keep saying that like it means something, but last I checked my name is on the deed, not yours." not the HOAs. So unless you've got an actual legal reason to be here, I suggest you and your neon brigade find somewhere else to lunge in unison." The air between them crackled with tension. Karen's hands balled into fists at her sides, but before she could launch another tirade, her phone rang. She snatched it up, barked a quick, "I'll handle it," then turned back to Jake with a look that screamed, "This isn't over." Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off, rallying her bewildered followers like a disgraced general retreating from battle. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. He knew Karen, knew she wouldn't let this go. And sure enough, less than 24 hours later, an official-looking envelope was taped to his door. Inside was a notice, written with all the aggressive politeness of a passive-aggressive HOA board, informing him that his property was now designated for mandatory compliance inspections and that failure to adhere to community regulations would result in further action. Jake rolled his eyes. Further action? The woman had already trespassed, tried to fine him, and called a glorified mall cop on him. What was next, a medieval siege? Whispering like schoolgirls plotting a prank. And then she pulled out bolt cutters. Jake's jaw tightened. She was actually about to break in. He watched as one of her followers hesitated, nervously whispering something that made Karen pause. With an exasperated sigh, she shoved the bolt cutters back into her oversized handbag and stormed off, but the message was clear. This wasn't over fine. If she wanted to break the rules, she was about to see what real chaos looked like. That night, Jake sat at his desk, laptop open, a wicked grin stretching across his face. He had spent weeks listening to Karen preach about community engagement. Well, she was about to get plenty of it. The next morning at exactly 8 a.m., Jake left his garage wide open. A note was taped to the door. "Welcome to the new community event. Enjoy." Right on schedule, Karen and her battalion of spandex-clad warriors marched up the driveway, confidence renewed at the sight of the unlocked door. Karen strutted inside like she had just reclaimed her kingdom, arms crossed, already savoring her victory. "I'm so glad you finally came to your senses, Jake," she cooed. Jake just smiled. Then he pressed the button. With a deafening whirr, the commercial-grade foam machine roared to life. A tsunami of thick white foam erupted from the walls, swallowing the floor in an avalanche of soap. It surged forward with unstoppable force, consuming everything in its path. Karen's smug expression crumbled in real time. "What the—" Her words were cut off as the foam surged over her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. Shrieks filled the garage as the Zumba warriors flailed, slipping, sliding, tumbling over each other like characters in a slapstick comedy. Karen stumbled, arms pinwheeling wildly before she disappeared into the foamy abyss with a glorious faceplant. On the sidewalk, a crowd gathered. Phones were out. Recording, Jake stood back, coffee in hand, watching the chaos unfold through his security cam feed, crying with laughter. "Jake!" Karen's voice was barely audible over the laughter, the screams, the sheer pandemonium. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "But Karen, this is a community event!" She shrieked, wading through the foam, slipping every few feet, her pink tracksuit soaked and clinging to her like a second skin. Her warriors, once proud and energetic, were now unrecognizable. Drenched, exhausted, and desperate to escape the bubble-infested disaster. The mailman, bless him, had stopped mid-route to record the spectacle, grinning ear to ear. "Best thing I've seen all year," he muttered. Karen, furiously beyond words, clawed her way to the exit, foam dripping from her face like she had just crawled out of a swamp. "Turn it off," she screeched. Jake took a slow sip of coffee. "I don't know, Karen. I thought sharing spaces was part of the rules." Her eye twitched violently. "This is war," Jake grinned. "Then you better bring reinforcements." Karen flailed wildly, her pink tracksuit now clinging to her like a second skin, drenched in thick foamy bubbles. The Zumba warriors were no better. Some slipped and tumbled to the ground, arms flailing in a futile attempt to find stability, while others waded desperately toward the exit, their once dignified, synchronized movements reduced to panicked scrambling. The garage was no longer a dance studio, it was an uncontrollable sea of chaos. From the sidewalk, the crowd of neighbors had grown, phones raised, capturing every humiliating second of Karen's downfall. A few chuckles turned into outright laughter as she shrieked, slipping once again, landing flat on her back in the foam. Jake, sipping his coffee with the calm of a man who had just won a battle without breaking a sweat, tilted his head slightly. "Karen, you said this garage was for community events, right? Well, you're welcome." She spat out foam, struggling to stand. "You think this is funny?" Jake grinned. "I think it's hilarious. her fists clenched, her entire body shaking with barely contained rage. "You humiliated me! This isn't over!" She stomped toward him, only to slip once again, vanishing beneath another wave of bubbles as the crowd erupted into even louder laughter. Even the mailman, who had paused his route to watch, let out a low whistle. "Damn," he muttered. "Best thing I've seen all year." Karen finally managed to crawl her way out, dripping, furious, looking more like a half-drowned raccoon than the feared HOA tyrant she believed herself to be. She turned toward the remaining members of her fitness group, who were now standing on the sidewalk, soaked, humiliated, and clearly reconsidering their allegiance. "We are not leaving," she screeched, foam still clinging to her face. "This is our space, and I will not be bullied out of my own event." Jake simply shrugged. "Or still doing the class?" Karen narrowed her eyes. "Yes." Jake reached into his pocket and casually turned the foam machine to max. A deafening whoosh filled the air as a tidal wave of thick white foam engulfed the entire garage. Karen barely had time to react before she was swallowed by it, her scream muffled as the soap cascaded over her. The rest of her class had already begun retreating, no longer willing to follow their fearless leader into battle. The street was in an uproar, neighbors laughing, cheering, clapping. The footage of Karen's downfall would be internet gold, but Jake knew Karen well enough to know one thing: she wouldn't just accept this loss. She would double down. And she did. The next morning, Jake woke to an ominous, official-looking envelope taped to his door. The language inside was drenched in legalese, but the message was clear. Due to repeated violations of community guidelines, his property was now flagged for mandatory compliance inspections. Non-compliance would result in further action. Jake sighed. Of course, he checked his security footage out of sheer habit, and sure enough, there she was, Karen and two of her most loyal followers, loitering outside his garage, whispering frantically. Then, in an act so absurd he had to rewind the footage twice to believe it, Karen pulled a set of bolt cutters from her oversized handbag and marched toward the locked garage door. Jake's eyebrows shot up. Was she seriously about to break in? One of her minions whispered something nervously, making Karen pause. With an irritated sigh, she shoved the bolt cutters back into her purse, throwing one last glare at the garage before storming off. Jake exhaled a slow, deliberate breath. That was it. He had been playing nice, letting her dig her own grave, but if Karen wanted to escalate things to this level, she was about to learn a hard lesson. He didn't lose. At night, Jake sat at his desk, fingers tapping rhythmically against his laptop, an idea forming in his mind. It was time to go nuclear. He scrolled through his contacts, found exactly who he was looking for, and fired off a quick text. Jake. "Hey, remember that HOA horror story you told me about last year? Want to help me with a little payback?" A few seconds later, his phone buzzed with a reply. "Connor? Oh, hell yes, what do you need?" Jake's grin stretched wide. The next morning at precisely 8 a.m., Karen stormed out of her house, ready for battle, but the moment she stepped onto her front lawn, she froze. Her eyes went wide, her mouth opened, but no words came out. Across her perfectly manicured yard, across her pristine driveway, in giant bold letters for the entire neighborhood to see, were the words, Oak Aaron. The tyrant of Maplewood beneath it, a beautifully curated montage of her greatest hits, her falling face first into foam, her slipping in a panicked frenzy, her drenched and seething, was being projected onto her own garage door. Neighbors began gathering immediately, some laughing, some whispering, some recording. Karen, breathless with rage, turned to find Jake already waiting. He leaned casually against his car, arms crossed, the smuggest smirk plastered across his face. Karen screeched, "Jake!" Jake just lifted his coffee and a toast. "Morning, Karen. Enjoy the show?" Her scream could probably be heard 3 blocks away. Karen stormed off, her soaked tracksuit clinging to her like a second skin, leaving behind a trail of foam and sheer humiliation. The crowd erupted in cheers, some neighbors high-fiving, others still recording, their laughter echoing through the street. Even the mailman, shaking his head in disbelief, muttered, "Best delivery I've seen all week." Jake, still grinning, leaned casually against his car and took another slow sip of his coffee. This had gone better than he had ever imagined. Karen had wanted a war over his garage. Well, she had just suffered her first casualty. But he knew her. She wouldn't lick her wounds and accept defeat. No, Karen was the kind of person who would double down, and she did. The very next morning, a thick stack of papers was taped to Jake's front door, an official-looking legal notice, printed in the most aggressively passive-aggressive font imaginable. "Dear homeowner," it began, Due to multiple violations of community standards, you are hereby required to attend a formal hearing with the HOA board to discuss appropriate disciplinary action. Jake barely suppressed a laugh. Disciplinary action over foam? He flipped through the documents, eyes scanning the ridiculous accusations. Endangerment of community members, destruction of common-use spaces, and his personal favorite, deployment of hazardous chemical weaponry. Jake snorted. She's really calling my phone machine a weapon. He turned the page and, oh! There it was, the piece de résistance. Karen was officially pushing for his eviction. Jake's amusement faltered for a split second, his eyes narrowing. So, that's the game she wants to play? Fine. If Karen wanted to escalate things to the nuclear level, she was about to find out he had bigger warheads. By the time Jake showed up at the HOA hearing later that afternoon, the tension in the room was thick. The usual lineup of HOA board members sat at a long table shuffling papers with exaggerated importance, while Karen sat at the center, her arms folded smugly, a smirk stretching across her still puffy face. Bob, the HOA president, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Jake, he started, rubbing his temple as if he already had a headache, we've received numerous complaints regarding recent incidents involving your garage. Karen leaned forward, her voice dripping with feigned concern. He has repeatedly violated community standards, displayed open hostility toward board decisions, and used chemical warfare against community members. Jake actually laughed out loud. Chemical warfare? Karen, it was foam. Karen ignored him, continuing her dramatic performance. This kind of reckless behavior cannot be tolerated, and frankly, the community would be safer without someone who resorts to such extreme and dangerous actions. Jake exhaled, shaking his head. Right? So, I'm the problem, not the woman who tried to illegally break into my garage? The room fell silent. Jake took his phone out of his pocket, tapped a few buttons, and turned the screen toward the board. Crystal clear security footage played. Karen, bolt cutters in hand, standing at Jake's garage, attempting to break in, with her minions watching nervously. The silence stretched. Bob blinked. Karen, what am I looking at? Karen's face drained of color. That's taken out of context.
Jake smirked. Really? What's the context for breaking and entering? A ripple of murmur spread through the room. Bob sighed, rubbing his temple. Karen? This is serious. Karen's lips parted, searching for an argument, but for the first time in HOA history, she had nothing. Bob looked at Jake, then back at Karen. We can't enforce unapproved rules, nor can we allow board members to engage in questionable legal behavior. Jake sat back in his chair, enjoying every second of it. Bob flipped through the HOA paperwork, frowning. Actually, now that we're reviewing everything, Karen, it looks like most of the policies you've enforced weren't properly voted on. He turned to her with a sigh. Karen, I think we need to discuss your position on the board. Karen shot up from her seat. You can't do this. I am the HOA. Bob shook his head. Not anymore. The room erupted into hushed gasps, a few neighbors exchanging amused glances. Karen stood there, frozen, her entire empire crumbling in real time. Then her face twisted in pure fury. She whirled on Jake. You think you've won?
Jake grinned. Yeah, kind of. Karen let out a strangled scream, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her. Jake turned to the board, exhaling in mock relief. So, does this mean I get to keep my foam machine? Bob sighed, massaging his forehead. Just don't use it as a weapon again, Jake chuckled. No promises. Jake stepped into the HOA meeting with the confidence of a man who had already won before the first word was spoken. The usual lineup of board members sat stiffly at the front, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. Karen, however, sat with a manic sort of energy, her stack of papers clutched in her hands like it contained nuclear codes. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, her hair frizzed, her eyes wild, and her posture radiating a desperate need for control. Bob, the HOA president, cleared his throat, looking at Jake with the wary expression of someone who had been dragged into a circus act against his will. Jake, he sighed, already sounding done with the whole situation. We've received numerous complaints regarding your recent activities. Karen shot up from her seat before he could finish. Complaints? she shrieked. "Try violations. This man has turned our peaceful community into a lawless disaster zone. He openly mocked HOA regulations, humiliated me in front of the entire internet, and deployed dangerous chemical warfare against community members." Jake blinked. "Karen, for the last time, it was phone." She slammed a stack of papers onto the table. "It's all documented. My lawyer has drafted an official motion to expel him from the neighborhood." Bob picked up the papers, squinting at them before sighing heavily. "Karen, this isn't a dictatorship. You can't just evict people because you don't like them." Karen turned red. "He's a menace, and because of him, I have become the laughingstock of the internet." Jake smirked. "Pretty sure you did that all on your own, Karen." Bob rubbed his temples. "Let's just get to the facts. Jake, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Jake leaned back, stretching dramatically. "Sure. First, I'd like to introduce Exhibit A." He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and held it up. On cue, the crisp, high-definition footage of Karen trying to break into his garage with bolt cutters played for the entire room to see. The silence was deafening. Bob slowly turned to Karen. His eyebrows raised so high they practically disappeared into his hairline. "Karen, what is this?" Karen opened and closed her mouth, her brain visibly scrambling for an excuse. That's taken out of context," Jake smirked. "Oh, really? What context makes breaking and entering okay?" The room erupted in hushed whispers. Even the other HOA board members, usually Karen's loyal lapdogs, were side-eyeing her now. Bob let out a long, suffering sigh. "Karen, this is serious. You can't just change HOA policies without a proper vote. And you definitely can't break into someone's garage." One of the board members, a woman named Linda, crossed her arms. "Honestly, I've been saying for months that Karen's been overstepping her authority." Another board member nodded. "Yeah, this whole mandatory shared space rule, that was never approved. She just made it up." Bob flipped through a folder, frowning. "Now that we're reviewing everything, it looks like a lot of the policies Karen enforced weren't actually voted on by homeowners." Karen went rigid. "You can't do this," she shrieked. "I am the—" Bob shook his head. "Not anymore." The room went silent. Jake sat back, enjoying every second of Karen's implosion. Bob took a deep breath. "Effective immediately, Karen, you're removed from the HOA board." Karen's face contorted like she'd been slapped. "You can't?" "Oh, we can," Bob said, rubbing his temples. "And, honestly, we should have had a long time ago." The murmurs in the room turned into stifled laughter. A few neighbors exchanged amused glances, clearly relieved to see the tyrant dethroned. Karen turned beet red, her breathing shallow, her fingers shaking as she clutched her useless lawsuit paperwork. Then, in one final desperate act of rage, she whirled on Jake. "You think you've won?" Jake, ever the picture of calm, took a slow sip of his coffee and grinned. "I mean, yeah, kinda." Karen let out a strangled scream, grabbed her purse, and stormed out of the meeting, slamming the door behind her so hard that a framed photo fell off the wall. Bob exhaled. "Well, that was something," Jake smirked. "So, I don't have to pay that fine, right?" Bob let out a tired laugh. "No, Jake, you don't have to pay the fine." Jake let out a dramatic sigh of relief. "Good. I was planning to spend that money on more foam." The entire room burst into laughter. With Karen officially dethroned, the neighborhood finally breathed a collective sigh of relief. The insane policies she had forced upon everyone were immediately revoked. The garage sharing mandate? Gone. The ridiculous fines? Voided. The entire HO, once an oppressive dictatorship under Karen's iron grip, became a normal homeowners association again. And then, the cherry on top, Jake's viral foam party video exploded even more. His notifications were insane. The footage of Karen flailing around in the foam, the screaming, the neighborhood cheering as she was ousted, it spread like wildfire. It got picked up by news sites, featured in HOA horror stories. Compilations even made its way into meme culture. Jake leaned back in his chair, watching the numbers climb. Maybe this wasn't just a one-time thing. Maybe he had just unlocked something big. One thing was certain. Karen was gone, but the HOA drama, oh, it was just getting started. The silence was unsettling. For the first time in years, there were no snarky HOA emails, no ridiculous fine slipped under his door, no Karen barging onto his property like she owned it. Jake should have been celebrating. He had won, after all. But if there was one thing he knew about Karen, it was that she didn't know how to lose gracefully. So when he stepped outside one morning to grab his mail and noticed something new, something impossible, he froze. A for sale sign had been planted in Karen's front yard. Jake blinked. No way. He barely had time to process the shock before a moving truck rolled up. The back door swung open and out stormed Karen, barking orders at the movers as they hauled out box after box of her overpriced designer furniture. Jake couldn't resist. He casually strolled down his driveway, coffee in hand, and leaned against his mailbox. "Morning, Karen," he called out cheerfully. She stiffened. Her entire body radiated pure rage as she turned, eyes narrowing into slits. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. Jake took a slow sip of his coffee. "Oh, I know it's funny." Her face burned red. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Jake raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you mean exposing the fact that you illegally changed HOA rules, tried to find me from my own garage, and then attempted to break into my property? Yeah, Karen, I know exactly what I did." Her fists clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. "You ruined me!" she shrieked. Jake tilted his head. "Nah, you did that all by yourself." She let out a furious noise, something between a growl and a scream, and turned back to the movers. Jake watched, deeply enjoying every second as they hauled out her belongings. One by one, neighbors started to gather, whispering, exchanging amused glances. A few exchanged sly smiles. Then someone clapped. Jake turned to see old Mr. Hendrick from 3 houses down, standing in his bathrobe, slowly applauding. Then another neighbor joined in, and another. Within seconds, half the neighborhood was outside, cheering. Some even pulled out their phones to record the moment. Karen's entire body went rigid as she realized what was happening. She whirled around, face contorted in rage. "You're all monsters!" Jake chuckled. "Nah, we just enjoy a good community event." The crowd roared with laughter. Karen, seething, stomped toward her car. Foam residue still clung to her tires from last week's disaster. She yanked open the door, threw herself inside, and slammed it shut. The engine roared to life, and with one final screech of her tires, she peeled out of the driveway, leaving behind a cloud of dust and the tattered remains of her reputation. As the moving truck rumbled away, Jake turned back to the crowd, clapping his hands together. "Well, folks," he said, grinning, "I think we just had our first HOA-approved eviction." A loud cheer erupted. Someone popped a bottle of champagne. A few neighbors broke out into an impromptu dance party on Karen's now vacant driveway. Jake couldn't have asked for a better ending. With Karen gone, the neighborhood felt different, lighter. Conversations with neighbors were friendlier. No one lived in fear of some ridiculous fine for having their trash bins out a minute too long. And best of all, Jake could finally enjoy his home without the looming threat of HOA tyranny. But then, just when he thought the saga was finally over, his phone buzzed. Notification, viral video update. Jake's eyebrows lifted. He opened the app and immediately burst into laughter. Karen's foamy downfall had just hit another 1,000,000 views. The clip of her screaming in the bubbles, the entire neighborhood celebrating her departure, it was everywhere. It got picked up by major meme pages. Twitter was on fire. Even news outlets had started covering the story. Jake scrolled through the comments, laughing at the sheer savagery of the internet. "Oh, Karen gets the eviction speedrun any percent. She really thought she was the final boss. But my guy hit her with the ultimate counter. Bro turned his garage into a foam-powdered revolution, and I respect it." And then, there it was, the comment that sparked an idea. "Yo, you gotta keep this going. Expose more insane HOA stories." Jake sat back in his chair, rubbing his chin. Maybe this wasn't just about his garage anymore. Maybe he had tapped into something bigger. A movement, a slow smirk stretched across his face. Karen was gone. But oh hey drama. Oh, it was just getting started. Bob shifted uncomfortably at the front of the room, flipping through a stack of HOA bylaws as though he were only now realizing just how deep Karen's corruption had run. "So, turns out most of the rules Karen enforced were completely illegal?" he admitted, rubbing his temple. A ripple of laughter spread through the assembled homeowners, some shaking their heads in exasperation, others openly chuckling. "We're scrapping the garage-sharing policy," Bob continued, barely keeping the embarrassment out of his voice, "voiding all fines issued under her leadership, and let's just say the HOA is about to be a whole lot less insane moving forward." Jake, lounging casually in the back row, grinned. "Does this mean I get to keep my foam machine?" Bob sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Jake, just don't use it as a weapon again." The room burst into laughter. It was perfect. The neighborhood, once a battlefield where Karen ruled with an iron fist, was suddenly normal again. People could leave their trash bins out an extra hour without fear of getting a ticket. Kids played in their yards without Karen scowling from her window. And best of all, Jake could finally enjoy his own property without HOA tyranny looming over him like a storm cloud. It should have ended there, but it didn't. A few days later, Jake woke up to chaos. His phone buzzed nonstop. Notifications fluttered in from texts, emails, and social media alerts. Confused, he grabbed his phone and squinted at the screen. Breaking news! The HOA nightmare that went viral. Jake sat up so fast, his coffee nearly spilled. Karen's downfall, his foam-fueled rebellion, had officially hit the mainstream media. Clicking through the articles, he saw his garage-turned-foam party featured in news reports, reaction videos, even late-night talk show segments. A homeowner fights back against an overbearing HOA dictator. And folks, you have to see this footage. Viewers are calling it the most satisfying HOA takedown of all time. The internet is obsessed with HOA Karen's meltdown. Jake scrolled through the comments section, barely able to contain his laughter. This guy just did what we all dream of doing, petitioned to elect Jake as the new HOA president. Some men fight wars. Some lead revolutions. Jake drowns dictators in foam. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. What had started as one petty neighborhood dispute had become something bigger. He had tapped into something huge. And then, at the very bottom of the comment section, he saw it. Dude, you have to make this a series. Expose more HOA Karens. Jake sat there, staring at the screen, the idea forming in his head like a lightning strike. Maybe this wasn't just about his garage anymore. Maybe he had just unlocked something bigger. A movement. That afternoon, he grabbed his camera, stepped into his now Karen-free garage, and hit record. "Hey guys," he said, smirking. "So, what's the craziest HOA horror story you've ever heard?" The response? Explosive. Jake watched in awe as the numbers kept climbing. His inbox overflowed with messages from people across the country, homeowners, renters, even former HOA board members, all eager to share their own nightmare stories. Some were absurd, others downright infuriating. One person had been fined for having a too colorful garden. Another had been cited because their Christmas lights were up one day past the HOA deadline. But the ones that really caught Jake's attention, the full-blown HOA power trips. UN comments stood out. "Dude, my HOA president threatened to tow my car from my own driveway because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Can you help me expose these people?" Jake grinned. Oh, this was getting good. He fired up his camera and hit record. "All right, guys, so it turns out Karen was just the beginning," he said, smirking. "The HOA horror stories you sent in? Next level. So I think it's time we do something about it." He named the series HOA Hell, Exposing the Madness, and the internet ate it up. The more stories he covered, the bigger the movement grew. People weren't just watching, they were participating. Neighbors were secretly filming HOA board meetings. Homeowners were sending in documentation of shady fines and ridiculous regulations. Jake had unknowingly tapped into a nationwide frustration, and the floodgates had officially opened. One morning, he woke up to an email with a subject line that made him pause. "Jake, I have the ultimate HOA nightmare for you." He clicked it open, his curiosity piqued. "You think Karen was bad? Wait until you hear about the HOA president in my neighborhood. Let's just say she makes Karen look like a saint." Jake leaned back, a slow grin spreading across his face. Oh, this was about to be fun.